When I was a boy, one of my favorite vacations was to the west coast of the United States. Coastal Oregon, smack dab in the jewel that is the Pacific Northwest. My family had no real roadmap for the trip. Instead, we drove south along the coastline, exploring anything and everything that caught our eyes. One place in particular from this vacation holds a very special place in my heart. It was a lark, pure chance that we even happened to stop from our cruising speed along the highway. At the time, it was this tiny, out-of-the-way shack that offered my parents the ability to buy and imbibe that magic bean juice that kept them awake during the daylight hours. Manned by a single employee, the shack stood guardian to an unassuming trail leading off towards the ocean. It looked passable, skippable even, with no promise of anything special laying at its end. That shack employee urged us to go and explore. That this out-of-the-way, quiet pit stop not lit with large signs or crowds of people was something incredible. I'm glad we listened to her. At the short trail's end was something I'll never forget. Jagged, wicked-looking rock cut harshly into the shoreline, forming a long U-shape. Cerulean blue water, whipped with frosty white foam, rushing quickly from the ocean to fill the U's interior space. The water moved at a breakneck pace, forming waves, swirls, and when the rush of liquid violently collided with the jagged rocks, geysers shot into the air, spraying the land with salty foam. The violence of the movement, juxtaposed with the glistening of the seawater, made it all too clear why this place had been given the ominous moniker, Devil's Churn. From the trail, we hopped onto those jagged rocks, skirting the boundaries of safety to get a better look, and we discovered that a little further down the rocks gave way into sand, forming a hidden beach. There were maybe 2 other people on it. We ventured forth with the confidence of Indiana Jones. At the time, I thought it couldn't get much cooler than the Churn. I was wrong. Rocks interplayed with sand, forming pits that filled with seawater. Though the tide was low and the water line far away, I found these pools to be filled with the most precious of treasure, life. Anemones, crabs, and barnacles filled our vision as we explored each one. But the best part? The starfish. Purples and oranges in a stunning variety of hues coated the rocks, both in and out of the pools. 5-pointed bodies were so densely packed, some were practically on top of each other. The memory is so clear for me, the smell of the sea air, the distant crashing sounds of the churn, and the dazzling star-shaped custodians of the tide pools. We stayed there for hours. I remember taking hundreds of pictures of the tide pools, which my mother would later sort and frame a few for me as a gift. I hung them proudly in my room for years to come. These stars that covered the coastline became very special to me. I still often cling to that memory, still so vivid, as I watch unfold the great tragedy that would take them away from me. Pandemics don't just affect humans. We're just the only species that can do anything about them. Oh hey, I didn't see you there. You're listening to Bio-Diversity, the podcast about pelagic paradigms and coral curiosities, where we bring the best in flippin' fun fish facts straight to your ear holes. It's like we're the delivery drivers of peer-reviewed aquatic science, the Grubhub of fish food for your mind, the DoorDash of dope decapods. Here on the show, we examine the weird, the wacky, and the wonderful diversity of life that lives under the crashing waves of our blue home. Using cutting-edge science as our guide, we dive deep into both the common and the rare, the exotic and the ugly. So tune in for the tuna, stick around for the scorpion fish. Let's descend. Today on the show, sea stars, and an examination of an epidemic of a different variety. Bit of a disclaimer here, this is a bit of a downer episode. I'm sorry, but the truth does suck sometimes, and even in the face of bad news, we can learn and do better for the future. So with that in mind, because I know you all love your doom scrolling so much, let's hit that bad news first. The sea stars are dying. All along the rocky coasts of the United States, where there were once abundant gardens of stars to rival the starry heavens, the tide pools are empty.
When a sea star comes down with sea star wasting syndrome, it starts getting these white lesions on its body, and it gets a twisted appearance. The body seems deflated, and this progresses to massive tissue loss. The sea stars appear to be just melting away, and eventually the arms may break off, and the animal will die.
The current epidemic began in 2013, when scientists and citizens began to take notice of something strange happening. Instead of colorful, healthy stars, people found these blobs. Gross, white, almost mucousy-looking, mushy blobs. Over the course of the year, on both the west and east coasts of the United States, more and more of these blobs started cropping up. Not only that, but the recognizable sea stars that were found appeared mutilated. Arms had fallen off and appeared twisted. White lesions appeared along the entire star, and mass tissue decay was evident. Within a matter of days, these seemingly sick stars had deteriorated entirely, leaving nothing behind but this mucousy mess. Populations of sea stars in a matter of months took a drastic nosedive. Mass mortality hit tide pools and deeper waters alike. As observations poured in from 2013 and into 2014, it was seen that the disease wasn't limited to just one species. It almost seemed like every sea star, from the uniquely beautiful 16 to 24-legged sunflower star to the more traditional 5-rayed ochre sea star that I was so fond of taking pictures of. Nothing seemed safe. Scientists scrambled to try and understand just what was going on. The disease was fast-acting, progressing from onset to death in a matter of weeks, sometimes even days. It seemed like a doomed race. Populations of stars were quite literally melting away before we could even grasp how or why. The disease jumped from species to species, habitat to habitat, and things began to seem bleak. So the clock began ticking. Can we do anything to save the stars from a blobby doom? Or do we simply have to sit back and watch natural selection take its course? Okay, pause. That's pretty doom and gloom, huh? How about we switch up gears for a second to talk about sea stars at a broader level? Let's talk about why they're so cool, and what roles they play in the ecosystem and our planet, and why they're honestly so important. So let's start with, what is a sea star? Sea stars belong to the phylum Echinodermata, grouped together with sea urchins, sea lilies, and sea cucumbers. So what makes an echinoderm an echinoderm? Is it because all of them have the prefix sea in their English common name? Hark and verily no, for seahorses are fish of a different phylum. For me, two major things point out to an animal being an echinoderm. The first is what science likes to call radial symmetry. Symmetry is easy, right? We all know what symmetrical means. Wrong. Leave it to science to complicate even our simple kindergarten-level worldviews. Radial symmetry is fancy science talk for a very specific type of symmetry, saying that you could fold the organism in half in several different places and have those halves match. This is different from bilateral symmetry, which is what you probably know, where you can only fold it in half along one plane and have the halves match. Different still is biradial symmetry, spherical symmetry, icosahedral symmetry. You taking notes? This is riveting, I know. Most commonly, the radial symmetry in echinoderms manifests itself as 5-pointed. For example, most sea stars have 5 limbs. It's not always 5, though. As mentioned before, the sunflower star can have up to 24 limbs. 5 is just the most common. Even the less obviously echinodermy of the echinoderms have this kind of configuration. Look at the majestic sea urchin, for example. It may not look it at first glance, but behind the prickly bristles of these goths of the sea, you'll find that same radial body pattern. Look at sand dollars, and look at the beautiful fan-like and color-splattered arms of the crinoids. All of them are arranged in these radial, symmetrical parts. But podcast man, I hear the dissenters say, sea cucumbers are long and loggy. That's not radial. To this I say, that's absolutely correct. They do look long and loggy. However, beauty is only skin deep, and one must look past their astonishingly regal appearance to see their true character. Their tentacles and their internal calcium carbonate skeleton have this 5-section symmetry. Neat, huh? The second feature of echinoderms is a two-parter. 2 for the price of 1, heck of a deal. You're welcome. Both relate to the anatomy of the echinoderm. The first unique feature is their endoskeleton. Apart from sounding like the name of the spooky final boss of the end world, all this means is that the skeleton is inside the body, not outside. Just like us. Often, the skeleton is made of calcium carbonate. The skeleton itself varies, but in the starfish, it's made of these cool kind of interlocking pieces right underneath the skin that are called ossicles. These pieces, these ossicles, are made up of crystalline calcite. To clarify, calcite is just one of several forms of calcium carbonate. These crystals often arrange themselves in these beautiful honeycomb-looking lattice structures that support the echinoderm. Interlocking crystalline lattices, it sounds like I just described an expensive chandelier, not a bone structure, huh? Since I know ossicle is now your new favorite word, here are some additional ossicle facts. As interlocking building pieces of the skeleton, these small parts can come together and spread apart to create some really cool variations. In sand dollars, they all fuse together to form the rigid test, or the shell in non-science speak, that is so distinctive and so prized by beachcombers. In sea urchins, fused ossicles actually form the pokey spines that ward off the predators and really, really hurt. Not that I know from personal experience, what are you talking about? Ossicles are so cool, they even form the perfect segue into the second echinoderm unique feature, the water vascular system. One specialized ossicle structure, called the madreporite, is essential to the water vascular system in some echinoderms. That's a lot of big words, so let's paint a picture of what that all means. As a human, you have muscles. Muscles are what enable you to move around. Duh, right? Well, guess what? Sea stars lack a full complement of muscles, and yet they are capable of movement. What in the name of science? Most echinoderms are capable of locomotion, and this is thanks to that aforementioned water vascular system. This is a series of interconnected tubes, or canal-like structures, that run through the entirety of the animal. Think about how you, as a human, have a series of blood vessels that carries your blood throughout your body to and from the heart. It's kind of like that, except instead of carrying blood, these tubes carry seawater. Also, as fun point of side fact, sea stars and other echinoderms lack a true heart. So, imagine, if you will, the basic sea star. 5 points, pretty colors. Got it? Good. Now, imagine that inside that central part, that part that you might call the body of the star, there exists this big ol' ring-shaped tube, like an interior inner tube. This is called the ring canal. From this ring, imagine 5 connecting tubes, each one shooting off into one of the star's arms. Each one of these is called a radial canal, a tube ring with 5 totally tubular arms. With me so far? Now, picture that, lining all up and down these radial canals, on both sides, are tiny little turkey basters, pointed downwards. Tons of these little bulbs in a row, all connected to the radial canal. Follow the baster downward, now going outside of the skin of the sea star, and what do you find at the other end? A tiny little sucker. These little suckers are what you see when you see the echinoderm's feet, kind of like when you see a sea star at the aquarium and they're climbing up on the glass pane. This whole turkey baster structure is called a tube foot. If you want to sound smart and impress a date, the bulb parts are called the ampullae, and the foot parts are called the podia. Got the mental image? If not, I'll try to include an image in the show notes for you to look at your leisure. This whole system of tubes, from the ring canal all the way down to the podia, gets filled with seawater, and that specialized ossicle, the madreporite, also known as the sieve plate, is what lets it in. This sieve-like structure is basically a fancy biological valve. Once this whole system is charged with water, the echinoderm is ready to move. By contracting the ampullae, the podia can be filled and extended. Or to put it more simply, the animal can squeeze that bulb part of the tube foot, which causes water to flow into the foot part, which stretches outward. It can regulate the pressure in all of its feet, which, again, they have hundreds, by doing this, expanding and retracting repeatedly to grab onto a surface and pull itself forward. These tube feet have an adhesive chemical on their sucker-like ends, so in the end you have this powerful, albeit slow-moving, creature that can climb almost anything. These things that define echinoderms are far from all that's cool about them. Take, for instance, how most sea stars get their energy, by hunting. Now, they can be grazers, but this slow-moving, chill superstar of an animal can also be a voracious predator. It can hunt and eat a variety of mollusks, arthropods, and even small fish. How? By literally puking out its own stomach and digesting its prey to death. Most sea stars have evolved this ability to avert or expel their own stomach, and that stomach can engulf the star's intended prey, beginning to digest it while still outside the star's body. Once the meal is partially digested and small enough, it will pull in its stomach along with the remainder of the prey back inside the body. It can even spit its stomach into a tightly closed bivalve, and through the small opening, digest the poor thing inside its own protective shell. That's the most metal thing I've ever heard. Do you realize how terrifying this is? Sure, eels having 2 sets of jaws is pretty scary, but being digested alive? That's another level of nightmare, and honestly, movies could stand to profit from it. Drop me a line, Hollywood. This is also to say nothing of their ability to regenerate. Got an arm lopped off? Grow a new one, no big deal. Some species can even do this in reverse. Whole body gone and only one arm remains? Nah, dog, let me just grow my whole body back. Seriously, that bee monster movie is sounding really great right now. Move over, Mega Shark, it's time for Gigastar. Man, sea stars are cool, huh? By now I just know that you're absolutely convinced that they're an aquatic treasure. How could you not be? Seems like a perfect time to transition back into the main story. You know, the depressing one. This is 2020 after all. And that story is coming right up, right after this sponsored message. Heh, just kidding. This show's not sponsored. Sea star wasting disease, or SSWD for short. That's the term that many scientists began to call the phenomenon. Sea stars, once covering the coast from seafloor to tide pool, vanishing seemingly overnight. I remember that I returned to the West Coast years later in the midst of the crisis. I hadn't even heard about it, and I was looking very forward to seeing my beloved sea stars again. Imagine my disappointment when I could barely find any when I was combing the coast. I asked one of the volunteers at Monterey Bay Aquarium in California what was happening, and they had to be the one to deliver the heartbreaking news. I remember later that day staring out at one of the piers. There was a singular orange star clinging to the side of one of the supports. It looked healthy, vibrant even, being battered by the sloshing tide. It was one of fewer than 10 stars I found on that trip. They were so few and far between, I couldn't help but mourn. It felt like a blow to my chest. The symptoms of the disease are grotesque. Usually it begins with the appearance of white lesions, a grim omen of things to come. These lesions can spread rapidly and are followed by the onset of decay. The tissues surrounding the lesions begin to necrotize. The star, literally, begins to melt. During this time, that internally regulated water vascular system, the one that lets the star move and breathe, it begins to fail. The star can no longer maintain appropriate pressure in its vasculature, and as a result, it goes limp and can lose its grip on whatever it's adhered to. In the final stages, the melting gets worse as the body begins to entirely break down. Arms can twist and fragment off the main body, and eventually nothing is left but a disintegrated ooze. A healthy sea star can go from asymptomatic to dead in a matter of days. One study, looking at mortality in an over 100-mile stretch of coastline in California, noted an 81% mortality rate in ochre stars between 2012 and 2015. Another study looked at an 1,864-mile range all the way from California up to Washington, finding similar 80 to 100% declines. Currently, the list of affected species numbers over 20. The effects of this die-off are huge and affect more than just the stars themselves. Sea stars are what are called a keystone species, meaning they have a major influence on the way that their ecosystem works. Without them, the ecosystem can change drastically. In the years since the disease onset, we've seen the effects of their absence in real time. In areas of Oregon, beautiful kelp forests once blanketed certain sections of the coast. Sunflower stars would prowl about, hunting on some of their favorite prey, sea urchins. But when the stars vanished, the urchins found themselves without much threat. Their populations exploded, covering the seafloor in a blanket of red and purple spines. And what's to feed the hungry masses? The kelp itself. An explosion of hungry urchins can decimate already stressed kelp beds, and all but prevent any chance of recovery after the fact. The result is as close to an apocalyptic wasteland as you can imagine, where once towering fronds of kelp formed massive forest, beams of light gently illuminating the living blue, now are endless rocky barrens with broken roots and a carpet of spines. Once these desolate seascapes are created, they can persist forever. Thankfully, in years since the disease's onset, scientists and conservationists have launched into action. Data collection and studies began to try and understand the root of the issue, and to see if anything could be done to stop the spread of SSWD. As with most diseases, we were quick to point our finger at a microbial culprit. A paper by Ian Hewson and his associates, published in 2014, found an association between SSWD and a particular type of virus, adensovirus. The paper called it the most promising candidate disease agent responsible for asteroid mass mortality. It was a promising lead at the time. But, as scientists want to do, this prompted further studies, a few by Hewson and his team themselves, and these studies revealed that an association was an unlikely cause for stars across the board. In fact, outside of the one species in the original study, it seemed unlikely that a single agent was responsible at all. A follow-up paper in 2018 speculated that the SSWD outbreak across all species had several causes, not just one. Here, now, in 2020, we're still only slightly closer to understanding the true underlying cause of the disease. The more we look into it, the more it seems that the causes can be varied and complex, even though the symptoms are similar. The first suspect, the densovirus, was found to be a part of the normal day-to-day biomes of healthy sea stars in various species. In 2019, another related densovirus was discovered in stars on the opposite coast, the Atlantic coast, but again, a conclusive association between the new virus and wasting could not be drawn. The more we investigated trying to pin the crime on a singular microbial culprit, the more evidence had mounted against that explanation. So what could possibly be going on? The most current research has some interesting speculations. There are a few studies that are recent enough to still be in preprint at time of this recording, meaning they have yet to be peer-reviewed, though both tackle a similar idea. Rather than a conventional model of one species of microbe infecting and causing a disease, that perhaps it's a result of increased numbers of several varieties of microorganisms that begin to inhibit the body functions of the star. It's a lot to understand, but the two papers together lead to some interesting thoughts. If you didn't know already, microbes are everywhere. They're these little tiny organisms, some of which can live, breathe, and reproduce, just like us. They live in the dirt, on your skin, and even in your stomach. And not all of them are bad. With the COVID-19 virus dominating the news cycles this year, and many terrible diseases being attributed to bacteria, it's hard to think of these microbes as anything but an enemy. But a lot of them are harmless, non-pathogenic, and even a few are beneficial to us. This is true even for sea stars. Microbes can live on their skin and in the water surrounding them. From that understanding, we can take a look at a new possible route of exploring what's happening. The first study I'm going to talk about is titled Evidence that Non-Pathogenic Microorganisms Drive Sea Star Wasting Disease Through Boundary Layer Oxygen Diffusion. This one is by Citlalli A. Aquino et al. In this paper, they look at the epidermis, or skin, and body wall of the organism. It's important to note that, unlike humans, sea stars don't have lungs. Oxygen is still just as important to them, though, so they breathe through surfaces on their body via diffusion. In order for that to happen, there actually has to be oxygen dissolved in the water that the star surrounds itself with. Oxygen dissolved in the water can naturally cross the barrier of the sea star's skin, allowing the animal to inhale. A lot of background for sure, but it's important. Remember how there are microbes on the surface of the sea star? As living things, they too require oxygen. The study looks at a variety of factors, but they point to an interesting new hypothesis, that a general proliferation of microbes on the skin surface of the star might lead to suboxic conditions at that boundary. Or, in other terms, as the amount of microbes requiring oxygen goes up, they consume the oxygen in the water first, leading to very little oxygen left to diffuse into the star itself. One could almost say that the star is being choked by a mass number of microbes, if one wanted to put it bluntly. Further, as part of that same study, they were actually able to produce some data that correlated low oxygen conditions with sea star wasting. In tanks where researchers artificially lowered the dissolved oxygen levels, they actually artificially induced wasting lesions in 75% of the stars in the study. So that's point number 1. Sea star wasting might be correlated with low oxygen, and increased numbers of microbes on the star's skin might cause low oxygen. Got it? Point number 2 comes from a paper called Virome Temporal Variation During Sea Star Wasting Disease Progression in Pisaster Ocraceus, again by our friend Ian Hewson et alia. This study looked directly at those white, terrible lesions that are associated with the disease, and the populations of viruses surrounding them. They did this both for lesions that appeared from SSWD, as well as experimentally inflicted scars. They basically took tissue samples from healthy tissues, margins of the artificial scars they inflicted, and margins of the wasting tissues where the disease was, and compared the populations of the viruses that they found. Not only did they further show that even healthy stars have a rich and complex community of several viruses that is just normal for them to have, they also demonstrated that the wasting lesions had significantly higher richness, or a number of viral species, than did either the healthy tissue or the artificial scars, meaning potentially that these lesions support general viral growth. So point number 2 is that after wasting onset, the species' richness of viruses goes up. Let's put all of this together in a hypothetical timeline. We start with a healthy star. The water around it is clean, and it can intake water normally to fill up its water vascular system, and it can breathe the dissolved oxygen. There's a healthy and happy microbial community living on the star's skin. Then, something happens. Factor X, some kind of change. The oxygen-needing microbes on the surface of the sea star increase, slurping up the oxygen. With so little oxygen left, the star begins to choke. The suboxic conditions result in tissue damage, our white, gross lesions. Unfortunately for the star, these lesions just lead to even worse microbial growth, and eventually, worsening symptoms to death. Does this explain everything? And is this conclusive evidence of a cause? No, absolutely not. The timeline is pure speculation on my part based on my understanding from these studies. But all of this does bring us one step closer to an understanding. Science. There's another big point of discussion to address here. That big unknown, the factor X. Just what is it that happens to kick off this wasting process? As usual, we can't say for sure, but there is some evidence that points to a few factors that play a huge role in all of this. The first? Water temperature. Some studies positively correlate rising water temperature with higher incidence and mortality of the disease. This is not true across the board with all stars and all studies, but on paper it makes sense. As water temperature rises, dissolved oxygen levels lower. Higher temperatures may also support the growth of those oxygen-hungry microbial species. And the second? Organic matter. This is any matter that contains the element carbon. This can come from several sources: pollution, land runoff, storms, massive algal die-offs. And these microbes, growing rampantly and choking the star? A lot of them seem to be copiotrophs, meaning that they thrive and proliferate in high-carbon environments. There's some documented evidence that correlates mass algal die-offs with outbreaks of the disease. And to add to that, the increasing levels of carbon dioxide emissions in general has led to an increased level of dissolved oceanic carbon dioxide being documented over the years, providing the potential for even higher carbon levels. A perfect storm for suffocating sea stars. Higher carbon dioxide levels, warming temperatures, storms, and pollution? Man, that sounds familiar. I wonder if there's like a buzzword or catchy phrase we could use to discuss that concept. Where's Captain Planet when we need him? Now, clarification. It is tempting to say that this is a smoking gun, but it's not. There are a lot of assumptions I just made here, as well as plenty instances of the disease that defy these predictions, just as there are instances that support them. But for me, the research is enough to redouble my efforts to try and do everything that I can to combat our impact on global temperature. It's further evidence to me that we are responsible for some kind of negative impact on the planet, even if we don't fully understand it. Okay, the gloom and doom part of the program is mostly over now. You can relax. Let's talk a bit about what the future holds, and discuss if there's any hope for these poor afflicted echinoderms. The good news is that even without human intervention, we're already seeing some evidence that recovery is happening, albeit very slowly. One report as recent as November 5th of 2020 from the multi-agency Rocky Intertidal Network looks at the recovery of the ochre star along its range. In this report, they state that, quote, Oregon and Northern California data presents the most positive picture for Pisaster ochraceus, unquote. In this region, juvenile star survivorship has been substantial enough to give some hope, with some sites returning to pre-SSWD levels or more. However, in other areas such as Southern California, Alaska, and Washington, we do not see this high survivorship of juvenile ochre stars. Recovery in these areas is slow if it's happening at all. And of course, this is only looking at one species. Each star species has its own reproductive and survival strategies, so how each one will be able to respond to and survive this crisis has yet to be seen. There are also a few studies that look at the genetics of the ochre star, and it was some good, if not predictable, news, demonstrating that SSWD is a force of natural selection that the populations of ochre stars are adapting to naturally. I'm sure by now a lot of folks have heard of Charles Darwin and his theory of natural selection, and that does appear to be happening here. The adults that survive the wasting might be able to spawn juveniles that are resistant to the disease. These studies looked at the mechanical Lego building blocks, the genetics, and found that the genetic adaptation is occurring. In the long term, this might mean that the sea stars might be able to evolve to deal with the disease. Improvise, adapt, overcome. Even with the forces of evolution at play, it's unclear what the timeline for recovery of any of these species even is. More research is needed. Isn't that always the way in science? But if some of the current theories prove true, that warmer temperatures and heightened organic matter is a core cause, it's more evidence piling on top of already mounting data that we need to be taking climate change seriously. Some of our actions have far-reaching and great consequences that we don't even know about. I still have hope. Hope that one day, through a combination of science, conservation, stewardship, and policy, we might again see the marvelous star-spangled beaches I remember from childhood. But it's going to take work. Change on both an individual and a community level. Those of us that care taking action and speaking up. So are you willing to help? That's it for today's episode of Bio-Diversity. If you want to get involved and learn what you can do to help our struggling stars, check the show notes for a list of my recommendations. I have hope for the future and belief that science will help find an answer. But what we do with that knowledge is up to us. A great person once said, "With great power comes great responsibility." Food for thought. I'll see you next time.